Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to David Patrick King about faith-based nonprofits and how evangelical Christianity specifically has helped shape America's philanthropic landscape. Let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today, I am pleased to speak with David Patrick King, the Karen Lake Buttrey Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where David is also Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies. David is an American religious historian whose interests include how the religious identity of faith-based nonprofits shapes their motivations, rhetoric, and practice. He is also the author of God's Internationalists, World Vision, and the Age of Evangelical Humanitarianism, a very good book published by the University of Pennsylvania Press just a short while ago, 2019. And we will be talking to David a good bit about that book. And finally, David is co-editor of a forthcoming book titled Religion and Philanthropy in the United States, which I think is coming out later this year. So welcome, David.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Am I right, first of all, about that last book coming out a little bit later in 2021?
Oh, we hope. We'll see if it makes it under the wire, but we're hoping that way. Yeah,
that's great. You are in a unique position to talk about religion and philanthropy, which is sort of becoming a common theme of this podcast, not necessarily intentionally, but it certainly has become a common theme. Thanks to your position at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which, if people don't know, is like the leading school of philanthropy in the United States, if not the world, which I'm sure it is in the world. So I'm going to pick your brain first about that and what you learned through your work at the Lake Institute, or just about religion and philanthropy generally, and then we'll talk about God's Internationalists, because it struck me in reading the book that America's philanthropic culture would be virtually unimaginable without the influence of evangelical Christianity. And World Vision story seems like a good way to sort of get at that larger story, which I suppose is partly why you wrote the book.
Yeah, it was a part of it. And I think it's a great way to get into those big conversations. It's a great set of questions.
Very good. So let's talk about the Lake Institute first. Just tell us, first of all, why does the Lake Institute exist? What does it do?
Yeah, well, Lake Institute is embedded in the School of Philanthropy here at Indiana University. And Lake Institute's been around for about 20 years with a distinct mission of fostering greater understanding of a dynamic relationship between faith and giving. We do that through research and scholarship. We do that through educational programs and a lot of public understanding kinds of work. So a lot of research on faith-based nonprofits, like congregations, for instance, that are oftentimes underexplored in what we know about the nonprofit sector. Most congregations are not filing 990 forms like other nonprofits. We don't know how much money comes in or where does it go. We spend a lot of our time, though, in education and training, working with clergy and faith-based nonprofit leaders, fundraisers, and finding that intersection between faith and sort of the religious traditions that many people see as primary in why they give, and how to make those connections about the distinct assets that our religious traditions bring to the nonprofit sector and to philanthropy. And we want to raise those big questions, the same kind of questions that you raised here on this podcast about what's the future of civil society, how do organizations fit into that, what does it mean for donors and individuals, and the future of our American faith communities and the civic good or public good more broadly. Yeah.
And well, okay. So let's just jump into some of those big questions. I'd love to get your opinion and your insight in some of these. One of the things, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy does is publish Giving USA every year, right? I'm correct about that. You guys, that's you.
Right. Well, we do a lot of we do the number crunching and writing and produce it with the Giving USA Foundation, but we do all the research that goes.
That's right. You guys are the engine that makes it go.
Right.
It wouldn't happen without you. It's a tremendous resource. I'm sure many of the listeners to this podcast know about it. If you don't and are interested in the numbers behind American philanthropy, you just Google Giving USA, and you can get the summary statistics for free. And if you want the big old deep dive document, there's some sort of fairly reasonable price for getting it. But one of the things we learn from Giving USA every year, and again, you correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, David, is a religion is you break it up by sectors, giving sectors, right? Like where is the money going? And religion is by far still the biggest piece of the giving pie in the United States. So my question for you is, how much longer will that be the case? Is that going to change in your mind or not going to change? What are the trends?
Oh, I think it's a great question. And Giving USA, and this follows a lot of, how the sector is broken down into 8 or 9 subsectors, religion being one of those, others like, arts and culture, education, social services, international humanitarian or development work would fit into that as well. So in all those different sectors, religion by far is the largest. And this past year, religion made up about 29% of all giving in the United States, as they were the recipients of that much giving. The second largest sector, education, was around 13-14%. So religion is not only the biggest, it's double the next biggest sector. That's the good news. The bad news is that religious giving subsector has continued to dwindle as a share of the overall pie of giving in America for the last several decades. As long as we've been tracking this since the late 70s and 80s, even into the 80s, religion made up well over half.
Really? I didn't know it had been that high. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's not the gift. It's not going back to the 1950s to today. It's more recently in the 80s. There are a variety of reasons for that. One is the specific way we define religious giving, which basically is giving to congregations, denominations, missionary societies, and religious media. Take, for instance, Christian radio, let's say. But that really is an important part, is the bedrock of a lot of those religious organizations. There are over 350,000 congregations, sprinkled across every big city, rural, suburban space in America. But think of all of those religious organizations that do work in social services. Think about World Vision, that would not be labeled as a part of that religious subsector. That'd be cast out. And think about all the Christian colleges or high schools, Catholic social services. All of that spread out. That's not counted in the religion category. That's all education or relief. Right. So all of that sprinkled into other places like relief or social services or education or healthcare. So thinking of all of those religious organizations that don't count, even narrowly defined, religious giving is about 29-30%. It's been about a third for the last decade. That is shrinking. So to your original question, how much longer do you expect this to, be the case for religion to be that largest sector? I think for another generation. I think that it'll change, not immediately, but I do think it'll continue to pull down as institutional religious communities change, as the rise of the unaffiliated grows, as there's more and more diversity across different religious traditions. I think that share of giving to religious giving, which is mostly congregations, will continue to dwindle a bit over time. But I think faith-motivated giving to all the types of organizations we talked about that are labeled in other spaces, I think will continue to grow. Well,
that's interesting. Do you think that will continue to grow? Because it would seem that if you don't have the sort of foundational identity giving affiliation with a congregation, as you put it, you may not be as motivated to give to a Christian relief organization or a whatever a Jewish school or whatever it might be. Is that you don't think that will be the case necessarily?
Well, I do think it's a both and. So I think one of the reasons for the decline in religious giving in that sector is rising rising disaffiliation. The rise of the nones, those who might say that they're none of the above when asked about their religious identity. But at the same time, that's one piece of the puzzle. Other pieces are just people are less likely to attend as often. There's a lot of competition for your time on a weekend, and that's increasingly apparent as we are. We haven't been in person, or many congregations have not been in person for a year now, or they've experimented with a variety of options. So I do think that congregations in that religious giving sector will face greater competition from other faith-based nonprofits. I think other nonprofits, take a World Vision, for example, oftentimes are somewhat clear in their mission and making the case for why they're not only a great recipient for your donations, but also have a very clear and compelling mission. Where a congregation, for example, has a much more a broad mission. They do a lot of things, right? They have to have worship and do education, outreach, evangelization. So I do think those faith-based nonprofits will continue to grow or to sustain themselves from donors where faith is an important motivating factor. And from what we're learning is that donors are willing to give to faith-based organizations despite that faith-based identity if the mission aligns there.
Are there, in your opinion, obviously there are very broad, large, powerful historical forces at play in contributing to the rise of unaffiliated nones with respect to religious identity. But are there technical ways to speak in that language, maybe, that congregations could there are things they could learn from the rest of the nonprofit world, for instance, or even business world, in reducing that outflow of people from the congregations? In other words, are there things that can be done to counteract those broad historical forces, or is this just a grin and bear it kind of moment for religious congregations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know if I have the full answer, but just having thought about this a good bit, I think this is a larger force that we've seen. America is not Western Europe, but you can sort of see some of those secularization trends more broadly historically that I think that are also taking place in the United States as well. That being said, though, I think there are plenty of ways that congregations can engage and do a better job in both nurturing the faith traditions of those in their community, passing them down across generations. So I think the formation, particularly in family units, and equipping families and communities and neighbors to be able to sort of nurture that faith for the next generation. We know that family unit is the most important for maintaining that religious identity, teaching it, and also that philanthropic giving identity as well. So the other thing that congregations can do is, just like good nonprofits know how to do, is to ask their donors or their constituents what's important. So and sort of moving away from a sense of obligation and we need you to give out of a sense of duty. We need you to engage in this way. What were the passions and the value sets for those in your community? Think about sort of moving outside the walls of one's congregation into community, whether it's down the road at the other, locally or across the world, and engaging that way, nurturing donors or constituents, inviting them to take part in a more active and less passive way, I think, are the kinds of questions that congregations need to address. And then finally, breaking down that sort of that silo or barrier from the nonprofit or the business world, or thinking about it's the kinds of questions about economics or entrepreneurship or ways to invest one's resources. Congregations have a lot of those assets, and they're not oftentimes asking the people who do this so well on a daily basis how to engage in mission and make transformation happen in their communities and around the world.
Yeah, I assume those are all good ideas. I assume you are not referring to asking your congregation, are they passionate about the Trinity or the Torah? That's not the sort of thing you necessarily want feedback on, doctrine stuff. But yeah, where are they finding? Where are the challenges in their lives? How could the congregation be of help to them? What sorts of issues are they dealing with that are just, really, really problematic and difficult?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in some sense, those who have been formed in a religious tradition, have particular theological beliefs, let's say, or practices, but translating that into life, I think, is the important bridge to be built. So, how does that impact me and my family, or in my job, or our own mission? How can we really engage the work around us? And to build those bridges and sort of break down any divides that might exist between kind of a Sunday and a Monday, but also thinking about how that, I think that translation has to happen, and people are craving it. They're looking for it. They're finding it in other places, but who's better situated to help to work through that meaning making of communities and individuals than those religious communities that have formed us.
So as we think about notwithstanding the things that congregations could do to forestall a decline in numbers or reverse a decline in numbers, assuming they are not successful, and to the extent they aren't successful in that, it strikes me that so churches are not just another kind of association we have in America. They are themselves sites of association. They're association makers, right? Other associations find their homes or are birthed out of congregations. Have you thought about, what happens? I've thought about, but I have an answer for. What happens when like the foundational associations sorts of deteriorate? What happens to all the rest of the kinds of voluntary associations that have made America sort of different than the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a worry that stays with me many days, because while I am optimistic about the creativity of congregations to reinvent themselves or to translate or to build those bridges that we talked about earlier, there's plenty that will not, and it's tough to turn that tide. And I do think these trends, will be with us as far as greater rising unaffiliation. And I think you're right that not only do many nonprofits or associations are embedded or are birthed out of congregations. Take, for instance, tutoring programs, clothes closets, food pantries, arts and culture, music, polling places, for goodness sake, are all kind of rooted in congregations. But there is that sense of formation and social. You are socialized into that associational identity, oftentimes in congregations. It was the first place I oftentimes had leadership responsibilities, as a kid or as a youth that were able to, take up the offering, asked to usher, teach or preach on youth day. I mean, these are the kinds of things that form our individuals as leaders and also shape them as community civic members as well. I think that there will have to be other outlets for some of that work. But I do think congregation we'll be missing something, and we'll have to. I think those are the kinds of questions that many civic communities have not quite understood the larger value of congregations in that space.
Right. It does seem like to the extent that congregations are assigned a value by the larger civic community, it's a sort of a strictly moralistic one, or even an individualistic sort of value. Like it could be, you can provide Yeah. A sense of meaning to people, or you can help make people less monstrous than they otherwise would be, but not this this civic, purely civic value of the sort of strong associational identities created by churches.
Yeah, and there are some good organizations that are trying to sort of name that more specifically. One would be Partners for Sacred Places, that really works a lot with historic congregations in particular. And one scholar, Ram Kannan at the University of Pennsylvania, has kind of created a number of studies that look at the halo effect of congregations. And you can kind of Google these short reports if you're interested. But almost the economic footprint of congregations, people who come into the city, let's say, calculating the value of that green space. Oftentimes, they have a number of arts or events, or the economic benefit of so many nonprofits renting or sharing spaces within a congregational building for the week. If they had to pay market rate for those offices, that would be really difficult for many nonprofits. So there are folks who are trying to sort of to calculate some of those features of congregations beyond the kind of if you care about this moralistic or this theological work, come here. But I think they're not in the minority. They're not in the majority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. What are the because you talk to donors and you deal with donors somewhat, givers, to use the phrase of our podcast title. What are the biggest concerns that they have about religious institutions or congregations, maybe in particular, and they're giving to those institutions? And maybe the reverse too. Like, what are the faith-based nonprofit leaders you deal with? What are their biggest concerns about their donors and their givers?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question we love to spend time with, and I love your focus on givers, because that's in our Lake Institute Faith and Giving name framing as well. But I would say oftentimes donors or givers, in working with congregations in particular, oftentimes worry that their congregations may not know how to be the best stewards of those gifts, or they rely on a handful of donors too much, or sometimes that they can't handle the kind of giving capacity that they might be able to engage with a congregation on. And so typically congregations rely on individual regular giving, through passing the plate on a Sunday morning or over a weekend, and are not as good with nurturing long relationships, building major donors. One thing that I think that congregations really often miss is planned giving, because oftentimes, what better place oftentimes for someone who's been engaged in a faith community for 30, 40 plus years, who's a regular giver. Maybe they're, that scale is not sort of, you're not going to be one of the top 5 biggest donors or givers on a regular basis, but you could give a very meaningful legacy gift that would continue your giving to that organization for years to come. But congregations have oftentimes shied away from it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're spot on. Do you see, is this changing? I guess this is the question for you. You would know. Like, are these practices starting to change where congregations, churches, synagogues, et cetera, are seeing that they could be doing a lot of the same things that, like you point out, the healthcare institution is doing, the hospital, the college are doing, and do it just as well?
I think this is kind of the apologetic for the work that we do on a daily basis. We are trying to make that case. I think we're doing this. I think we've been making steady progress, and it's not just us. Plenty of other folks are doing this as well. I think it's a mindset shift for many religious leaders to think about themselves and their roles, stewarding and fundraising and developing givers and donors. They don't see it oftentimes as part of their work, and I think that's a great loss, because I think they have all the skill sets that good fundraisers have. They're great listeners. They are able to connect and ask discerning questions. All of, developing long-term relationships, all the things that we want fundraisers to do and be religious leaders oftentimes excel in those particular soft skills as well. But they see that as not a part of their work. It's not what it's maybe the work they have to do in order to do the work that they want to do. And I think that's off base, because the way we think about fundraising is that it's nurturing those discerning passions and values in our donors, and enabling them and inviting them to engage in and being on mission with us, or to supporting the cause that they also believe in. And I think shifting that mindset is the wave that will need to happen for many religious organizations, because the economic models of giving in the regular obligatory type of way for religious organizations is not dead, but it's not
dying.
sustainable. Yeah.
and you feel it actually in the it's a feeling I've had in the pews, David, like it's just, there's it just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't even to someone who's very sympathetic like me out there. It's like, well, coming at me from like sort of obligation, sort of rhetorical tactic just doesn't, exactly light me up.
Well, and I mean, just on top of that, one more thing is that oftentimes the religious literacy within our congregations is much lower than it was several generations ago. So you can remind me that what my religious duty or obligation might be, but I don't know I don't know what a tithe might be. I don't know what the expectations that I should even be following. And so that language that we sometimes perpetuate doesn't necessarily hit with many of the folks who may actually be engaging within our communities. So we have to find new language, richer language, and developing those long-term relationships and talking about it. Yeah, I think people are willing to talk about it. They just, and they crave those conversations about money and meaning, but we let them slip by without asking.
I think you're right. David Patrick King, director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. We're going to be right back with David and talk about his book, God's Internationalists. We'll be right back. All right. We are back for Practicality with my friend and colleague, Abigail Alberti. How are you today, Abigail?
I'm doing good. Jeremy, how are you?
I'm doing well, except that I can't say your name, apparently. Abigail Alberti. Abigail Alberti. It's kind of hard to say.
Yeah, it's like alliterative, but also you kind of stumble over it. I totally get it.
You used to be Abigail Clevenger, and that was significantly easier for me for some reason. But don't tell your husband. Abigail is a senior consultant with us here at American Philanthropic, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about planned giving, which can be a little bit intimidating if you are, I'd say, maybe a little smaller nonprofit. But I think it's one of those things that basically I think almost anyone can do. Is that the case, Abigail? Should everybody have some sort of program when it comes to planned giving?
Yes, they definitely should. And let me tell you why. So it's really easy. Despite sort of, you think planned giving, you think like, difficult, tax situations and that sort of thing. But the vast majority of planned gifts are actually quite simple. But in terms of like, you're a small nonprofit, should I have a planned giving program? They're really easy to set up. They're low cost. They're easy to maintain. The other thing, if you're small in particular, if the other reason for setting up a planned giving program now is that it's a long-term investment. It can take years for you to realize planned gifts that are made, today. So you want to start now, to have a program in place to kind of reap the fruit years from now.
And there's a lot of money being transferred from generation to generations we've been hearing about for years now, but that really is starting to happen.
Yes. Yeah. And yes, absolutely. So the transfer of wealth from the baby boomer generation in particular is sort of upon us. Last year with the pandemic, just sort of general volatility in the world, we have seen the significant uptick in online will and bequest creators, increased response rates to planned giving communications, that sort of thing. So it seems to be, on donors' minds as something that more and more donors are interested in.
So okay, so I think it's clear you should do this as part of building out your development program if you're a nonprofit organization. But I mean, how hard is it? I mean, is there other simple things people can do to sort of get something reasonable in place?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few very simple tactics that I'd recommend, and those are these. So number one, first, use the right language. So the term planned giving is actually that's like jargon for fundraisers. Like most donors don't know what that means, so don't necessarily use that term. Talk about gift and estate planning, that sort of thing. So that's sort of like just for your own purposes. So really the first step is to develop some messaging. One or two paragraphs that kind of casts a compelling vision for what it means to leave a legacy, to remember this organization in your will or estate in an enduring way. How is this going to make a difference for years to come? So make it really, meaningful. Don't use transactional language, that sort of thing. Put it on your website. Just create a little section on your donate page. It doesn't need to be elaborate. Put those couple paragraphs on there. Put a contact person's name. You might list some of the different planned giving vehicles. Don't list 20, list like 2 or 3, I can leave this organization in my, make a bequest gift to this organization. I can, they can be the beneficiary of my life insurance policy or, maybe another option there. So keep it really simple and basic. And then look at your communications calendar and just add in really just one, you can do 1 or 2, but just like one planned giving themed mailer a year. It can be a short, letter where you're kind of casting the vision for what a planned gift means for the organization, with a reply device that, really just asks for like, yes, I've remembered this organization in my will or estate, or I want more information. And this is actually really important. Send that letter to a lot of people in your house file. So not just those who have given the highest gifts, but those who have given the most frequently and the longest, regardless of gift size. So like even your $25, $100 donor who's given to you for the last, 4, 5, 6, 10 years or so, those are actually really good planned giving prospects.
Right. They're great planned giving prospects.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They might not be able to give you like $10,000 cash outright, but they can leave you in your will. So kind of really that's it. I mean, you should also just include on your general reply form, like on your regular house file mailings, just a quick little checkbox. I remembered, this organization in my will or estate, or I want more information about, doing that. Optional things. If you have a budget, you can design some, really attractive collateral pieces about, planned giving for your organization. Again, that's optional though. You don't have to do that. Yeah.
Just getting going, doing a mailing, have a name, put it on your website, maybe name a legacy society. Usually that's the sort of name these things have, and just plant the seed with people. It is amazing. We see it with our clients, how the fruit that reaps, just those simple steps that can be done in a couple of days.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then it just runs on autopilot. You don't have to do a lot of, it's very easy to maintain. And we do find it's amazing. Like, sure. So some people might say like, why, I get planned gifts. Like, why do I have to have a formal program in place? Well, because we see that you actually will get more gifts by having a program in place. Like more. People. Yeah. It's like, you're telling your donors, like there's more than one way to support our mission,
Yeah. If you don't tell your donors that you want such gifts, you're not going to get many of them. But shockingly, if you tell them, we would like such gifts, you get more. It's really amazing how that works. Abigail, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
All right, we are back with David Patrick King, the Karen Lake Buttrey Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. I should note I'm particularly happy to speak with David because I am also an alumnus of Indiana University, although not a particularly proud basketball fan these days. Football is really coming on strong, though, so I'm going to hang my hat on that. The Lilly Family School, I should say, is at the campus in Indianapolis, in case you're going to drop by sometime. David, let's talk about God's internationalist. We'll just sort of shift gears here. I'm sure these are complementary concerns on your part, but it's a really good book. It's essentially a history of world vision, nested within a history in a way of evangelical humanitarianism, evangelical international relief efforts, and things like that. What led you to undertake this topic?
Well, it's you know how long books sometimes take to write, so it's hard to think back and say what was the reason for that. But for me, I think I've always been interested in as an American religious historian who really is interested in global questions. In college, I spent a summer overseas doing mission work in Gaza in the Middle East, and that really sort of opened as a kid from the South, from Alabama, as a Baptist kid, sort of just opening up the world to the way things looked was a game changer for me, and sort of how I saw the world and what I wanted to do through my vocation. And so it was around missions at first, but what I wanted to sort of partly see is how into the 20th century, the growth around relief and development work, faith-based relief and development work was, I think, key, and oftentimes not separate from missions or more evangelistic missions, but telling that story was important to see how that shift had happened for American evangelicals and the global church. And so World Vision as sort of started right after World War II and continued to rapidly grow into what it is today. And it seems like in many ways they encapsulated that story for me. And they were willing to put up with me as I spent a lot of time working with them and telling their story. And so I think it exactly right. It's a history that hopefully tells of an organization that hopefully tells a larger story.
For people who don't know, I assume as many people, because his name is not as well known as many as like Billy Graham or some other sort of important post-war evangelical figures. Who was Bob Pierce, and what was the sort of evangelical milieu out of which he emerged? I thought it was interesting that he comes out of Southern California, essentially, which seems to be the site of a lot of dynamic evangelical activity in the 20th century.
Right. No. So Bob Pierce was the founder of World Vision, but he started off in that sort of Sunbelt, Southern California hotbed of post-war evangelicalism, and in some ways wanted to be an evangelist. He wanted to be Billy Graham, and actually came up alongside Billy Graham within the Youth for Christ movement that launched Billy Graham in the 40s as well. And strangely enough, Billy Graham was supposed to go to Asia on a tour, evangelistic tour, and along with some of the other leading lights at that time, and couldn't make it. So Pierce jumped on a plane and went and saw the world in China. He had basically not been outside that, he barnstormed and preached around California and other kind of revivalistic tours, but hadn't really been out of the United States, hadn't seen poverty the way that he saw it in China post 1949. And then that he talked about his own conversion at that point to really using his calling to help particularly children in poverty around the world. And so he came back home telling that story, admonishing American evangelicals that, sort of in a broader sense that they had to do something. And that's how he sort of started. He became quite well known. He was really had a knack for media and public performance in a way. So after 1949, when China closed to sort of Westerners and missionaries, he eventually kind of, got a little bit lost, to be honest, back and forth, didn't know where where he would find his next calling, and found himself in Korea right at the beginning of the Korean War. Started orphanages, and then he was not the founder of this notion of child sponsorship, but man, he took off with it and sort of revolutionized that fundraising mechanism that made World Vision into one of the biggest organizations.
That was amazing to me. I did not know that. I had no idea where that concept had come from. But it didn't just revolutionize sort of a certain kind of relief fundraising, but the sponsorship idea is used everywhere, well beyond the bounds of evangelical Christianity.
And it was that connection that sponsorship oftentimes nurtures and is that one-to-one relationship with the person that you're helping. To be able to put that picture of a child that you sponsor on your refrigerator, to be able to correspond with them in some way through letters, through pictures, that made a difference in how that fundraising relationship worked.
Essentially, was able to scale personal charity through sponsorship. Would that be a good way to say it?
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
And he saw himself as you correct me if I'm wrong, not just as an evangelist for Christianity, but also somewhat for American ideals and principles. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, definitely so. I mean, he was a creature of his time, and so were most American evangelicals. And so he, when I talk with my students now and try to kind of tell them a picture of what the Cold War was like in the 1950s and 60s and beyond, it didn't quite land. But Pierce in particular, even like Billy Graham and so many others, was a creature of that time. And so it was oftentimes an American Christianity, an American exceptionalism that was helping to shape the world. So Christianity and democracy oftentimes went hand in hand together. And Pierce had a special relationship with the armed forces. He had a sort of media correspondent status, so he was oftentimes, preaching and teaching to the GIs, American soldiers in Korea. The same time he was working on the front lines with South Korean and North Korean troops too, particularly POWs. And this adventure streak, for some reason, Pierce was never happy at home, and he struggled actually with home life, and it was a difficult story, and it's part of World Vision's story, but that sense of wanderlust and adventure defined him, probably defined the first few generations of World Vision and many of those sort of post-war American evangelical voices. And he was most happy jumping out of a plane, running up alongside, a leper colony he just discovered and promised them money. And then he had to go home and figure out how to raise it and get it there. Flying by the seat of his pants was what he thought God was calling him to. And when you put too much organization around it, that's when he felt suffocated.
Yeah. It's a distinct type, isn't it?
Yeah.
We still meet these people. And they play a very distinct and I would argue an important role in the world. They can be very frustrating to be around and to try to keep up with and organize. For
many nonprofits, and I mean, it is he's clearly a founder. There's a founder syndrome there for Pierce, maybe, but World Vision would later say that World Vision could not have been founded without Bob Pierce. But at later point, they kind of would go on record saying, but it probably couldn't have sustained itself with Bob Pierce at some point.
To what extent did World Vision and other evangelical relief agencies, to what extent did they figure into the strategic thinking and planning of like America's foreign policy establishment? Were they considered sort of like players to be moved around the chessboard to some extent?
To some extent, although for the most part, particularly in the 50s, out of World War II, they were oftentimes left out of the conversation. So, and many times they were looking in at a table that was set for the mainline Protestants, Catholics, and even to some extent Jews. So that Judeo-Christian alliances that were built were really set with religious leaders that were oftentimes really shaping American foreign policy and the diplomatic corps out of World War II and beyond. But over time, they gained access, but it was sort of hard pressed. And someone like Pierce pushed really hard to get access. And so there are some great stories of the way that like sort of what become the International Christian Leadership Group, what would sometimes become the forebears for the modern Christian prayer breakfast, the prayer breakfast, presidential prayer breakfast network. Pierce was a part of that network and tried to inculcate that with political leaders around the world. And he was very successful getting access to the Prime Minister of India, the President of South Korea. And in many ways, that gave him entree or an argument that he was an essential part of that foreign policy apparatus for the government as well.
So World Vision now, according to your own book, has a budget of over $2 billion, 42,000 employees. How'd that happen? Like, what were the key, just for our listeners, what were the key inflection points in the organization's history that led to that massive growth?
Well, I do think, in so in some sense, they had to institutionalize, and so after they did that, kind of in their second to third generation, it really, you see that massive growth coming in the 1970s and beyond. So there were a few inflection points. One is they internationalized, and so World Vision International is an organization of about 100 partner country offices. And so while the United States, the U.S. offices is by far the biggest, and maybe makes up just under half of that multi-billion-dollar budget, there are major other institutions, World Vision offices. Australia, New Zealand are really large across Europe. And then many of what used to be receiving countries, the Korean, South Korean office is quite large. So the international, that shared leadership really made a difference. I would say another inflection point is, particularly in the 1980s, is that they exploded at the same time that media, particularly television, picked up on famine. So think of in Ethiopia in the 1980, 84, 85, the famines there, Live Aid, these kinds of conversations that really pointed to what now are disturbing images of distended, bellies and malnutrition. And they really knew how to engage in those media and use that to their advantage. So they grew really quickly in the 1980s. The other thing I think that's important to note is that they began to engage with not only the U.S. government, but also foreign governments and bilateral aid organizations. So they were able to become a part of the larger humanitarian network, the relief and development base organizations that can receive grants from the Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization and UNICEF and the United Nations, as well as like USAID, that really allows you to scale in massive numbers.
Yeah. The numbers get much, much bigger at that point. Their story is one of going from being a mission agency to a relief and development organization. And you note that 6 of the 7 largest evangelical mission agencies became, over time, relief and development organizations. What does that tell us about the nature of maybe institutional logic, or the nature of evangelicalism? Was it just the nature of the world at that time? Why that transformation?
I think if the largest organizations, so thinking at scale, I think those have moved more towards the relief and development type of work. So I think one level, it's just that's where the resources are. That's where arguably a lot of the needs are. But I would say, thinking through a missiological lens, thinking more practical theology, I think there's been some really interesting work that evangelicals themselves have done in opening up understandings of evangelism or a more holistic gospel. So thinking about both sharing an evangelical or evangelistic message alongside the need for physical, emotional, social, basic human flourishing capacities in order to be able to live fully. And so making sure that you're not preaching to someone with an empty stomach, but more thinking of the both and. Go ahead.
It's partly driven then just by experience in the field, you would say, that it was sort of like, our understanding of the gospel calls us to something larger here.
Yeah, and I think it's also a lot of pushback and reflective conversation from the global church. So World Vision story is an important one to think about how global evangelicals were talking back to westernized countries and saying, like, look, that you don't need to be thinking of us in this way. If we're in many ways, many of us in Latin America, we are Christian, right? Like, so, trying to think about how to wed both evangelism and social justice, let's say, in a way that fit within the evangelical tradition or the larger. And there's a lot of debates that World Vision was central in about sort of defining the nature of evangelicalism within the global church. And I love to tell their story through that lens, because whether it was the Lausanne movement or even more recent movements where maybe younger evangelicals are just as concerned with sex trafficking, child welfare, other kinds of environmental justice. These are kinds of questions that are also important, as well as the more evangelistic, mission-driven approaches too.
Can you talk about? I'll put you a little bit on the spot here, because this is not necessarily part of of the book. But can you talk about the associational heritage of the American evangelical tradition? It's that reshaping American society through voluntary associations has been central to the evangelical impulse since at least the early 1800s. What should people know about that history? In other words, like the kind of America's associational genius, if there is such a thing, as Tocqueville argued, and our evangelical traditions are very much intertwined, aren't they?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think that's true as we talked about earlier at the beginning of the podcast, with the vibrancy of religious community in the United States in distinct ways, is that particular Tocquevillian sort of point that he was making early on. And I think that's even more pointedly true, I think we know through history, through the evangelical tradition, thinking back into the 1800s in particular. A lot of those social agencies that were working towards abolition, that were working for education, et cetera, were born out of that evangelical impulse. And I think there's a unique voluntary nature that's a component of the evangelical framing. And so, thinking outside of simply the theological traditions that define evangelicalism, but the way that they associate, the way the evangelical tradition is oftentimes not so much defined by hierarchy and denominational identity, but it's more of that free market model approach, that voluntary agency of non-denominational congregations, parachurch groups. I think that allowed them to succeed, particularly into the 20th century, as the mainline or other Catholic Jewish organizations felt overly institutionalized. The ability to kind of engage and reach out through media, through local associational work, made those organizations thrive, and continues to be one of the ways that they have been able to gain market share, if to use that language, over many other forms of religious organization. David, are you working on another book? I'm playing with some ideas, actually. So I'm hoping to be a bit on sabbatical next year and write about a more fuller picture of faith and philanthropy in the United States. A lot of the histories that we read about philanthropy in America note, just like you did, the religious, the significance of religion in shaping the early nonprofit voluntary sector. But then as the Rockefellers and the Carnegies sort of secularized philanthropy, the way the story's told, it drops out of the picture. I'd love to tell the fuller picture there. And just the questions that you're asking, and you've done so much in your own work, we've been toying a lot with questions around philanthropy and the public good. Putting a question mark at the end of that statement and asking, what is the public good, and when or how do we know if philanthropy does the public good? So working across particularly some of the international context in which I'm interested in, they have very different notions of social welfare and democracy, and let's say the UK versus the Scandinavian country, that are oftentimes more critical of philanthropy than maybe we are in the States. I want to engage in those conversations, and I'm working on a project there too. But the kinds of questions you've asked around civil society in your work and on this podcast are right central to some of those questions. So I'll look forward to picking your brain and those who listen on those kinds of questions.
Not much to pick on, but I look forward to reading. I look forward to reading that and engaging with you on that work. That's fantastic. I really look forward to it. David King, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Jeremy. It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
David is the director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And before I let you go, David, where can people find Lake Institute and or you online?
Yeah, you could Google us, but we'd love to have you follow us on Twitter at Lake Institute, and I'm there as well. But Facebook or Twitter. Subscribe to our newsletter, Insights, which comes out every couple of weeks, where we try to curate a lot of the research and scholarship that we're finding, and be able to share that back out with our readers.
Fantastic. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Jeremy.